It all started on a warm summer morning in Virginia. The air was sticky with heat, and I could feel my scarf clinging to my neck as I stood outside the modest brick house. This was my first job in America, far from the dusty streets of Balka where I grew up. Back home, I'd never imagined leaving my family or my small world. But life had a way of surprising us. The Jacobs, a seemingly perfect family of 4, needed a nanny, and I needed the money. It wasn't just about the paycheck. It was about proving to my parents and siblings that I could do this, that I could thrive in a country so different from my own. I was 33, unmarried, and fiercely independent, a rarity for a Jordanian woman. Brianna Jacobs, the wife, was polished and stunning. She wore tailored blouses and designer heels that clacked against the marble floors of their spacious home. She greeted me with a warm smile, her blonde hair swept into a bun, and spoke in that deliberate way Americans do, as though they wanted you to know. Every single word mattered. Then there was Zach Jacobs, the husband. He was tall, with an easy charm that immediately put you at ease. His sandy brown hair curled slightly at the ends, and his laugh lines hinted at a man who had seen joy, not just stress. He didn't say much that day, just nodded politely and handed me a cup of tea. Their children, Splendor and Emmanuel, were 5 and 3, full of energy and endless questions. I was nervous, of course. I'd never worked as a nanny before, but Brianna assured me my experience as the eldest of 6 siblings would suffice. She was kind, but I could tell she was a perfectionist. She handed me a thick binder of rules, meal plans, daily routines, emergency numbers, and even instructions for folding laundry. The first few weeks were uneventful. I'd wake up at 6 a.m., prepare breakfast, pack Splendor's lunch for school, and keep Emmanuel entertained until nap time. My days were filled with storybooks, finger painting, and chasing Emmanuel around the backyard. At night, I'd retreat to my small room in the basement, exhausted but content. It wasn't until one afternoon, about a month into the job, that I noticed Zach watching me. I was sitting on the kitchen floor, wiping up a spill Emmanuel had made with his juice box, when I felt his eyes on me. "You're amazing with them," he said, leaning against the counter. I looked up, startled. "Oh, thank you, sir. Please call me Zach," he said, smiling. I nodded, feeling the heat rise to my cheeks. It wasn't what he said, but the way he said it, like he genuinely meant it. Back home, men rarely spoke to women with such kindness, unless there was an ulterior motive. But Zach seemed different. From that day, I began noticing him more. How he always asked if I'd had lunch, how he offered to help carry the groceries, and how he lingered in the kitchen when I cooked. Brianna, on the other hand, was often absent, busy with her high-powered corporate job. "Don't you ever get tired?" Zach asked one evening, as I was setting the dining table. "Tired of what? Of doing everything for everyone?" I shrugged. "It's my job. I'm used to it. You shouldn't have to be," he said, his voice soft. His words lingered with me long after he left the room. It was strange being seen like that. In my culture, women were expected to give endlessly, to serve without question. But Zach's words made me feel appreciated. I tried to ignore it, of course. I reminded myself of who I was and what I believed in. I was a Muslim woman bound by faith and tradition. There were lines I could never cross, no matter how kind or handsome my employer was. But life, as I would soon learn, had other plans. That summer stretched endlessly, the days long and hot. Brianna's work trips grew more frequent, leaving Zach and me alone with the children. Slowly, the boundaries began to blur. At first, it was innocent, shared jokes, stolen glances, and casual conversations that lasted a little too long. But deep down, I knew I was treading dangerous waters. I often thought of my mother's voice, stern and unwavering. "Aliyah, remember who you are. This world will tempt you, but you must stay true to yourself." I had always prided myself on my self-control, my ability to resist the temptations of the modern world. But Zach was different. It was a rainy evening when things shifted. The children were asleep, the house quiet, except for the sound of rain. tapping against the windows. I was in the kitchen, cleaning up after dinner when Zach walked in. "Need some help?" he asked, rolling up his sleeves. "No. It's okay, I'm almost done," I replied, but he stayed anyway. We worked in silence for a while, the air heavy with unspoken words. Finally, he broke the silence. "Do you ever miss home?" he asked. "Every day," I admitted. "But I came here for a reason." "You've sacrificed so much," he said, his voice tinged with admiration. I looked at him surprised. "Why do you say that?" "Because I see it. The way you put everyone else first. The way you never complain." It's rare his words caught me off guard. No one had ever spoken to me like that before. Not even back home. I felt a strange mix of gratitude and guilt, as though I was betraying something sacred. "Just by listening, it's nothing special," I said, brushing off the compliment. "It is to me," he replied, his gaze locking with mine. And in that moment, something shifted between us. It was subtle, almost imperceptible, but it was there, a connection, a spark, a silent acknowledgement of something neither of us dared to name. I went to bed that night with a heavy heart, torn between my faith and the growing feelings I couldn't ignore. I prayed for strength, for clarity, for the courage to stay on the right path. But deep down, I knew my world was about to change in ways I could never have imagined. I thought I could keep things professional, that whatever fleeting connection I felt with Zach would fade like a passing cloud. But life is rarely so simple. Each day brought new moments, small and seemingly insignificant on the surface. Yet each one chipped away at the wall I built around my heart. Brianna's absence became a routine. She was off to conferences in New York, business meetings in Chicago, or overnight stays at luxury hotels I'd only seen in magazines. Zach became the constant parent, and I became his partner in the day-to-day chaos of raising Splendor. And Emmanuel, the children adored him. Splendor would climb onto his lap during story time, her small hands clutching his shirt as he read aloud, and funny voices. Emmanuel followed him around like a shadow, mimicking his every move, watching them together. I saw a side of Zach that was tender and unguarded, and it stirred something in me I couldn't quite name. One afternoon, as I was folding laundry in the living room, Zach came in carrying a box. "I thought you might like this," he said, setting it on the coffee table. "What is it?" I asked, wiping my hands on my apron. He opened the box to reveal a set of cookbooks. "I noticed you've been trying new recipes lately. Thought this might inspire you." I stared at him, speechless. It wasn't the gift itself. It was the thought behind it. No one had ever noticed the little things I did, let alone appreciated them. "Thank you," I said softly, feeling the words catch in my throat. "It's nothing," he replied, but the way he looked at me said otherwise. That evening, after the children were asleep, Zach and I found ourselves in the kitchen again. It had become a kind of ritual, these quiet moments after the chaos of the day. I was wiping down the counters when he spoke. "You work too hard, Aliyah." I looked up, startled. "It's my job." "No," he said, shaking his head. "You do more than your job. You care, you love these kids like they're your own." "They're easy to love," I said, trying to deflect. "So are you." The words hung in the air between us, heavy and dangerous. I froze, unsure of how to respond. "Aliyah," I began, but he interrupted me. "I'm sorry," he said quickly. "I shouldn't have said that." "No, it's okay," I said, even though it wasn't. We stood there in silence, the weight of his words pressing down on us. I wanted to tell him he was wrong, that I wasn't easy to love, and that I was complicated and flawed, and bound by rules he could never understand. But instead I said nothing. The days passed in a blur. I tried to convince myself that nothing had changed, but deep down I knew it had. Zach's presence was everywhere. His laughter echoed through the house. His scent lingered in the air, and his voice replayed in my mind long after he was gone. I began to notice the little things about him. The way his eyes wrinkled when he smiled. The way he hummed under his breath while doing dishes. The way he always made sure the kids said, "Thank you and please." He wasn't just kind. He was thoughtful in a way that felt rare and precious. One afternoon, as I was pushing Splendor on the swing in the backyard, Zach came out with a tray of iced tea. "Thought you might need a break," he said, handing me a glass. "Thank you," I said, taking it gratefully. We sat on the porch steps watching the children play. "Do you ever think about what your life could have been?" he asked suddenly. I looked at him surprised. "What do you mean?" "I mean, if you'd stayed in Balka, if you hadn't come here all the time." I admitted, "But I came here for a reason." "And have you found it?" he asked. His gaze steady. I hesitated, unsure of how to answer. "In some ways, yes. But in others, it's complicated." He nodded, as though he understood life has a way of surprising us. "Doesn't it?" "It does," I agreed, my voice barely above a whisper. For a moment we sat there in silence, the air between us thick with unspoken words. I wanted to tell him how much his kindness meant to me, how his presence had become a comfort in a world that often felt lonely and foreign. But I couldn't, I wouldn't. That night, I lay awake in my room staring at the ceiling. I thought of my family back home, of my mother's prayers and my father's stern warnings. "Stay true to your faith," they had always said. "Never forget who you are." I wanted to believe I was still that girl, the one who prayed 5 times a day and wore her scarf with pride. But the truth was I was changing, and it terrified me. The next morning, I avoided Zach as much as I could. I busied myself with chores, keeping my head down and my mind focused. But by the afternoon, it was impossible to avoid him. He found me in the laundry room, sorting through a pile of clothes. "Aliyah," he said, his voice soft. I didn't look up. "Yes." "Are you okay?" "I'm fine," I said quickly, but he didn't believe me. "Please don't shut me out," he said, stepping closer. I know I crossed the line. "It's not about you," I interrupted, finally looking at him. "It's about me. My beliefs, my faith." "I understand," he said, but the look in his eye told me he didn't. "How could he?" "I can't," I began, but the words caught in my throat. "I can't do this," he nodded slowly, his expression filled with regret. "I'm sorry, Aliyah. I never wanted to make you uncomfortable." "You didn't," I said quickly. "That's the problem." For a moment, we just stood there, the silence between us, saying all the things we couldn't. "I'll give you space," he said. "Finally, thank you," I whispered, my voice trembling. As he left the room, I felt a wave of relief, mixed with an ache I couldn't quite name. I knew I was doing the right thing, but it didn't make it any easier. That night I prayed harder than I ever had before. I prayed for strength, for guidance, for the courage to stay true to myself. And as I knelt on the floor, tears streaming down my face, I realized something. I wasn't just fighting temptation. I was fighting a part of myself I didn't recognize. The days after our conversation in the laundry room were tense but manageable. Zach kept his promise to give me space, and I did everything I could to refocus on my job. I threw myself into taking care of Splendor and Emmanuel, planning crafts and baking, projects that kept us all busy, from morning until bedtime. But even as I kept my hands occupied, my mind wandered to him. Zach stayed cordial, almost distant, and I convinced myself that this was the best way forward. We could pretend nothing had happened, that the words we'd shared in the laundry room were just a moment of weakness. For a while, it almost worked. Then came the storm. It was a Friday evening, just after sunset, when the rain began. The thunder rolled in, first shaking the windows and startling Emmanuel, who clung to my leg as I cleaned up the dinner table. "Don't worry, Emmanuel," I said, scooping him up. "It's just a little noise. Let me get you ready for bed." "Okay." I carried him upstairs, reading his favorite bedtime story, while the rain poured outside. By the time both kids were asleep, the storm had grown stronger. The wind held and the house felt eerily quiet. Despite the chaos outside, I headed downstairs, expecting to find Zach in his usual spot on the couch. Instead, I found him in the kitchen, staring out the window with a glass of wine in his hand. His shirt sleeves were rolled up, and the soft glow of the kitchen light highlighted the sharp lines of his jaw. He looked deep in thought, and I hesitated in the doorway, unsure if I should interrupt. "You don't drink wine, do you?" he asked without turning around, as if sensing my presence. "No," I replied, stepping into the room. "It's against my faith." He nodded, finally turning to face me. "I figured as much. You're different. Is that a bad thing?" I asked, a small smile tugging at my lips. "Not at all," he said, his voice soft. "It's refreshing." I busied myself by wiping down the counters, trying to ignore the way his words made my heart race. The tension in the room was palpable, and I could feel his eyes on me as I worked. "Aliye," he said. After a long silence, "Yes," I replied, not looking up. "Can we talk?" I stopped wiping and turned to face him. "About what about us?" he said, his voice low. I shook my head, my pulse quickening. "There is no us, Zach." "Then why can't I stop thinking about you?" he asked, stepping closer. "Zach, please," I began, but he interrupted me. "I know it's wrong," he said, his voice trembling. "I know I shouldn't feel this way, but I can't help it. I see you every day taking care of my kids, making this house feel like a home." And he stopped, running a hand through his hair. "I've never met anyone like you." My breath caught in my throat. His words were everything I tried to ignore, everything I told myself I didn't want to hear. But hearing them now spoken aloud made it impossible to deny what was happening between us. "Zach," I said, my voice barely above a whisper, "you're married, you have a family." "I know," he said, his eyes filled with pain. "But Brianna is always gone, always busy, and when she's here, it's like we're strangers. You're the only one who makes me feel." He stopped again, as if the words were too difficult to say. I stood frozen, torn between the part of me that knew this was wrong and the part of me that longed to feel wanted, cherished, and seen. "Zach," I whispered, but it wasn't a plea for him to stop. It was something else entirely. A surrender. He closed the distance between us, his lips capturing mine, in a kiss that was gentle at first, then deepened as we gave in to the emotions we both been fighting for so long. His hands slid down to my waist, pulling me closer, and I felt myself melting into him, forgetting everything else. Brianna, the children, my faith, my family. In that moment, there was only him. We didn't stop at a kiss. That night, as the storm raged outside, we crossed a line we could never uncross. He led me upstairs to his bedroom, his touch igniting a fire within me I hadn't known existed. I let him undress me, his hands worshiping every inch of my body, as though I were something sacred. In his arms, I felt beautiful, powerful, and utterly free. It was nothing like I'd imagined. Back home, intimacy was never spoken about, a taboo topic that existed only whispers behind closed doors. But with Zach, it was different. He was attentive, patient, and passionate, making me feel things I'd never thought possible. For the first time in my life, I felt truly desired when it was over. We lay tangled together, the sound of the rain beating against the windows. I knew I should feel guilty, ashamed, even disgusted with myself, but I didn't. Instead, I felt a strange sense of peace, as though I'd finally found the missing piece of myself. The next morning, reality hit me like a freight train. As I got the children ready for breakfast, I avoided Zach's gaze, the weight of what we'd done pressing down on me. But when he caught my eye and gave me a small, Knowing smile, I felt that same rush of adrenaline I'd felt the night before. It didn't stop there. Over the next few weeks, we found ourselves stealing moments whenever we could. A lingering touch as we passed in the hallway, a whispered conversation in the kitchen after the children were asleep, a hurried embrace behind closed doors. Each time I told myself it would be the last, but it never was. Zach became my addiction, and I was powerless to resist him. He made me forget everything: my faith, my upbringing, the values I'd once held so dear. For a while, I let myself believe that we could keep this up, that we could exist in our own little bubble, without the rest of the world finding out. But deep down I knew it couldn't last, and when the bubble finally burst, it would leave nothing but devastation in its wake. The weeks that followed were whirlwind, a blur of stolen moments and whispered promises that filled my days with equal parts ecstasy and dread. Zach and I were careful yet reckless, finding time for each other when Brianna wasn't home, when the children were asleep, or when the house was empty. Each time we touched, I told myself it would be the last, but it never was. I felt like I was living two lives. During the day I was Alia, the devoted nanny who read bedtime stories, cooked meals, and smiled warmly at Splendor and Emmanuel. But at night, when the world went quiet and the house fell into darkness, I became someone else entirely. Someone who belonged to Zach in ways I'd never belonged to anyone before. One evening, after the children were tucked into bed, Zach found me in the living room folding laundry. Brianna had left that morning for another work trip, and the house was unusually still. He stood in the doorway watching me, his presence filling the room before he even spoke. "Do you ever stop working?" he asked, his voice tinged with amusement. I looked up, smiling despite myself. "Someone has to keep this place running." He crossed the room and sat down beside me, his thigh brushing against mine. "You're amazing, you know that." I shook my head, laughing softly. "I'm just doing my job." "No," he said, his tone serious. "Now you're more than that. You've done more for this family than I think Brianna or I ever could." I felt a pain of guilt at the mention of her name. "You shouldn't say that." "Why not?" "It's true." I avoided his gaze, focusing on the pile of clothes in front of me. "You love her, Zach. She's your wife," he sighed, running a hand through his hair. "I do love her, but not the way I should. Not the way I love you." His words hung in the air, heavy and undeniable. I wanted to tell him he was wrong, that he couldn't love me, that what we were doing was nothing more than a mistake. But I couldn't, because deep down I knew I felt the same way. He reached for my hand, his fingers intertwining with mine. "Aliyah, look at me." Reluctantly, I lifted my eyes to meet his. The intensity in his gaze made my breath catch in my throat. "You mean everything to me," he said. "I know this isn't right, but I can't imagine my life without you." The tears I've been holding back finally spilled over, and he pulled me into his arms, holding me tightly as I cried. "I'm sorry," I whispered. "I never meant for this to happen." "Neither did I," he said softly. "But I don't regret it." As the weeks turned into months, our affair became harder to hide. Brianna's absences gave us the freedom to indulge in our forbidden relationship, but the moments when she was home were unbearable. I avoided her as much as I could, ashamed to look her in the eye. She was kind to me, trusting, and utterly unaware of the betrayal unfolding under her roof. "Alia, you've been such a blessing to this family," she said one evening as we sat in the kitchen. "I don't know how we managed before you came along." Her words felt like a knife to my chest, and I forced a smile. "Thank you, Mrs. Jacob. Please call me Brianna," she said, laughing lightly. "You're practically part of the family." Her trust only deepened my guilt, but it didn't stop me. Each night after Brianna went to bed, Zach would find me. Sometimes we'd talk, other times we'd simply hold each other, lost in the silence of the house. More often than not, we'd end up in his bed, tangled in a passion That made me forget everything else. One night, after Brianna had left for a weekend conference, Zach and I shared a bottle of wine in the living room. I hadn't meant to drink, but he insisted, pouring me a small glass and teasing me until I took a sip. The warmth of the wine spread through me, loosening the tight grip of my self-control. "You're beautiful," he said, his voice slow and husky. "Do you know that?" I shook my head, feeling my cheeks flush. "You're just saying that I'm not," he said, leaning closer. "You're the most beautiful woman I've ever seen before." I could respond. He kissed me, his lips capturing mine in a way that left no room for doubt. This wasn't just lust, it was something deeper, something neither of us could name. His hands moved to my waist, pulling me closer, and I felt myself surrender completely. We didn't make it to the bedroom that night. Instead, we stayed there on the living room floor, the flickering light of the fireplace casting shadows on the walls as we lost ourselves in each other. It was raw, unrestrained, and completely consuming. The next morning, I woke up in his arms, the events of the night before replaying in my mind. I should have felt ashamed, but all I felt was a strange sense of contentment. For the first time in a long time, I felt like I belonged. As I got dressed and prepared breakfast for the children, Zach came into the kitchen, his expression soft. "Good morning," he said, kissing my forehead. "Morning," I replied, trying to keep my voice steady. "We should talk," he said, his tone serious now. I nodded, knowing he was right. We couldn't keep pretending this wasn't happening. We couldn't keep living in this fantasy world we created. But even as I agreed, a part of me wasn't ready to let go. The days after that night in the living room passed in a haze. Zach and I became more reckless, consumed by the fire we'd ignited. Each moment alone with him felt like a stolen treasure, a secret I both cherished and feared. Yet the more time we spent together, the heavier the guilt grew. Brianna returned from her conference. The following Monday, her presence in the house, a stark reminder of the life Zach and I were dismantling. Piece by piece, she was warm and cheerful as ever, unaware of the betrayal playing out behind her back. Watching her interact with the children, I felt a deep sense of shame. She didn't deserve this, none of them did. One evening after Brianna had gone to bed, I sat on the porch steps, staring out of the darkened sky. The air was crisp, the stars scattered like tiny shards of glass. I wrapped my scarf tighter around my shoulders, trying to block out the chill and the thoughts swirling in my mind. Zach joined me moments later, his footsteps soft against the wooden floor. He sat down beside me, close enough that our shoulders brushed. "You've been quiet," he said, his voice low. "I've been thinking," I replied, not looking at him. "About us," I nodded, my throat tightening. "Zach, we can't keep doing this," he sighed, running a hand through his hair. "I know it's complicated. It's not just complicated," I interrupted, my voice trembling. "It's wrong. You have a wife, a family, and I've lost myself in this. I don't even recognize who I am anymore." He reached for my hand, his touch gentle. "You're still you, Alia. You're the woman who loves my kids like they're her own, the woman who's brought life back into this house. Don't let this ruin everything." I pulled my hand away, tears stinging my eyes. "But it has, Zach. Don't you see we've ruined everything?" For the first time, his composure cracked. "I love you, Alia," he said, his voice breaking. "I can't lose you." His words cut through me like a knife. I loved him too. There was no denying that anymore. But love wasn't enough to erase the damage we'd done. "I love you too," I whispered, the admission tumbling out before I could stop it. "But it's destroying me." The following week, I made a decision. I knew I couldn't stay not like this. The weight of what we'd done was too much to bear, and I couldn't continue living in a house built on lies. I began searching for a new job in secret, reaching out to agencies and families in need of a nanny. It wasn't easy. I'd grown attached to Splendor and Emmanuel, and the thought of leaving them broke my heart, but I knew it was the only way to save myself. One evening, as I was tucking Splendor into bed, she looked up at me with her wide blue eyes and asked, "Alia, are you leaving?" Her question startled me. "Why would you think that?" "Sweetheart, because you've been sad," she said simply. "And Daddy says people leave when they're sad." I forced a smile, brushing a strand of hair from her face. "I'm not going anywhere right now. Splendor, go to sleep, okay?" She nodded, closing her eyes. But as I left the room, her words lingered in my mind. People leave when they're sad. She was right, I was leaving. Because I couldn't stay in a place that had become a prison of my own making. 2 weeks later, I handed in my resignation. Brianna was stunned, her expression a mix of confusion and concern. "Alia, is everything okay?" she asked, setting her coffee cup down on the counter. "Yes, Mrs. Jacob," I said, keeping my voice steady. "But I've been offered another position, and I think it's time for me to move on." She looked genuinely hurt. "You've been such an important part of this family. Are you sure about this?" I nodded, unable to meet her eyes. "I'm sure Zach didn't say much when I told him." He just nodded, his jaw tight, his eyes filled with something I couldn't quite place. Anger, sadness, regret. "I can't change your mind, can I?" he asked quietly. "No," I said, my voice firm. "I have to do this." The day I left was bittersweet. Splendor and Emmanuel clung to me, their tearful goodbyes breaking my heart. Brianna hugged me tightly, thanking me for everything I'd done for their family. And Zach stood silently by the door, his hands clenched into fists at his sides as I loaded my suitcase into the taxi. I felt a strange sense of relief. The house that had been both my refuge and my prison faded into the distance as the car pulled away. I didn't know what the future held, but I knew one thing for certain. I had to find myself again. I had to reconnect with the faith and the values I'd abandoned, and I had to forgive myself for everything. That night in the small apartment I rented across town, I knelt on the floor and prayed. For the first time in months, I felt a sense of peace wash over me. I wasn't perfect and I'd made mistakes, but I was ready to start over. Hey everyone, if you found this story gripping and want to hear more like this one, make sure to hit that like button and subscribe for more jaw-dropping stories every week. Don't forget to turn on notifications so you never miss an update. If you have your own wild stories to share or ideas you'd like us to bring to life, drop them in the comments. I'd love to hear them. Thanks for watching.